Linux Mint has been in the news lately with some interesting claims that they've made about snap packages, like being backdoors and how they're forbidding installs of snaps through apt, and this is a pretty controversial topic. Some people might even call this some drama in the Linux world. So I felt I should make a video to address this, and not just to give my opinion on the subject. I will be doing that, but not just that, but also to research the topic and see if I can provide some context for you so that you can make your own opinion on this subject. Hi, I'm Michael Tennell of Tux Digital and the Destination Linux Network, and I make tech videos with a focus on free and open source software, Linux-based operating systems, gaming, and just all-around tech that I think is cool. So if this is something that you're interested in, then be sure to subscribe and ring that bell because you don't want to miss out on all the great content that currently exists and will exist on this channel. And if you find this video helpful, then you may also find other things helpful that I make because I make some podcasts. You know how a lot of YouTubers these days are jumping on the podcast train? Well, I'm more of the reverse of that because I currently have 3 podcasts that I do on the Destination Linux Network, and I'm now trying to do more YouTube videos. So if you appreciate this video and want more awesome content in podcast form, then check out destinationlinux.network for my podcasts, such as the weekly Linux News podcast, This Week in Linux, the Hardware Show, Hardware Addicts, and the namesake of the network, the Destination Linux podcast. All of these are fantastic. And yes, I admit that is a biased opinion, but it's also the correct opinion. And with that said, I think both Linux Mint and Canonical provide value to the Linux ecosystem, so I found this topic quite interesting. I'm going to give you context for what was said on both sides, from Linux Mint and to Canonical. I also did some research to find some comments from Mark Shuttleworth, the CEO of Canonical, though these comments and responses to people are on a forum, not directly to Linux Mint. And after all that, at the end of the video, I will give my opinion on the subject. Quick spoiler alert though, I disagree with Linux Mint and I think they handled this quite poorly. So let's get into the video. First of all, we should probably talk about what snaps are for those who aren't aware of what this whole thing is even about. So I made a video about what snaps are almost 4 years ago now. It was July 2016. And while that video is still mostly relevant, a lot has changed since then. And I probably shouldn't go over everything that is in what snaps are because that's a lot to cover. So I'm just going to cover the essentials to this topic. So snaps are an attempt to creating a universal app format for the Linux ecosystem. Snaps work on both desktop and server systems, so they're quite versatile in that sense. Snaps also have a containment approach for security purposes to isolate apps away from other apps and your system. So this all sounds great, right? Well, for the most part, this is a good thing. Canonical is making this format to solve a long-term structural issue, and something to address this issue is much needed. Snaps aren't perfect though, so there are some issues with them. I will cover some of those issues in this video, but that's not really what this video is about, so I'm not going to cover it extensively or exhaustively. I will absolutely be covering the topic in general in a future video on this channel because I do want to make that video explain why these universal app formats exist and why I'm glad they do. So if you're interested in that, then be sure to subscribe and ring that bell to get notified when I release that video on this channel. So let's now move on to the Linux Mint statements about snaps. And remember, I'm going to attempt to refrain myself from giving my opinion until after I provide context for both sides. I will interject some things here and there for clarifications though, just not my opinion based. And anybody who knows me knows that will be quite difficult for me to do. So let's try this. Linux Mint on their blog post in July 2019 stated the following. When Snap was announced, it was supposed to be a solution, not a problem. It was supposed to make it possible to run newer apps on top of older libraries and to let third-party editors publish their software easily towards multiple distributions, just like Flatpaks and app images. What we didn't want it to be was for Canonical to control the distribution of software between distributions and third-party editors, to prevent direct distribution from editors, to make it so software worked better in Ubuntu than anywhere else, and to make its store a requirement. Lots of places to interject there. Not going to do it. Canonical's decision about Chromium, we're going to jump ahead up to October 2019. So now we're going to jump to then and talk about what they did and what the blog post they talked about overall doing. So Canonical said that it was transitioning the Chromium deb package from deb to snaps. Chromium, as you probably know, is the open source web browser that is the basis for Google Chrome. Though if you aren't aware, Google controls both Chrome and Chromium as they are the developers of Chromium. And a quick side note, this video mentions Chromium a lot because that was the catalyst of sorts that started this topic. And I'm not really a fan of Google, so I don't recommend any browser based on Chromium since they make Chromium. I will say that name of that browser though quite a bit in this video, so I just wanted to be clear that I prefer and recommend Firefox. Just wanted to put that out there. So Canonical said back in the blog post in October 2019 that maintaining a single release of Chromium is a significant time investment for the Ubuntu desktop theme. And thanks to the appearance of major new versions of every 6 weeks for Chromium, that ensuring Chromium even builds and let alone runs on older releases of 1604, for example, can be challenging. The snap packaging solves these issues and lets the team build just one package per architecture. In 1910, the Chromium browser deb package and related packages have been made a transitional package that contains only wrapper scripts and a desktop file for backwards compatibility. When upgrading or installing the deb package on the 1910 release, the snap will be downloaded from the Snap Store and installed. Now we're going to move on to part 2 of Mint's statements. So in June of 2020, we're going to jump forward about 9 months for the current drama sparking the creation of this video, and I will continue to hold my opinion, but this part will likely tempt me. So, Linux Mint reiterated quoting that previous post saying, and I quote, "As you install apt updates, Snap becomes a requirement for you to continue to use Chromium and installs itself behind your back. This breaks one of the major worries many people had when Snaps was announced and a promise from its developers that it would never replace apt. A self-installing Snap Store, which overwrites part of our apt package base, is a complete no-no. It's something we have to stop, and it could mean the end of Chromium updates and access to the Snap Store in Linux Mint." End quote. Again, not going to interject. Let's continue. Linux Mint goes on to say, "A year later in the Ubuntu 2004 package base, the Chromium package is indeed empty and acting without your consent as a backdoor by connecting your computer to the Ubuntu store. Applications in this store cannot be patched or pinned. You can't audit them, hold them, modify them, or even point snaps to a different store. You've as much empowerment with this as if you were using proprietary software, i.e. none. This is in effect similar to a commercial proprietary solution, but with 2 major differences. It runs as root, and it installs itself without asking you." So many things to interject. They continue to say on the blog post, "I'm happy to confirm that Linux Mint 20, like previous Mint releases, will not ship with any apps or snap.d installed. Second, to address this situation, we'll do exactly what we said we would. In Linux Mint 20, Chromium won't be an empty package which installs snap.d behind your back. It will be an empty package which tells you why it's empty and tells you where to look to get Chromium yourself. Linux Mint 20 apt will forbid snap.d from getting installed. You'll still be able to install it yourself, and we'll document this in the release notes, but by default, apt won't allow repository packages from doing this on your behalf." So a couple days later, a Canonical spokesperson responded on a comment for the register.com article that was made about this. So the Canonical spokesperson says, "Canonical designs snaps based on a number of principles which include security, ease of use, and to reduce fragmentation in the Linux ecosystem. Outside of Ubuntu, Linux Mint has the highest number of users across all compatible distributions. These users have chosen to install snaps based on the reasons outlined above, among others. We would welcome Linux Mint to engage with us and our community to discuss such topics as we do with other distributions, and work together going forward." But I do have a clarification to add. The statement that Mint has the highest highest numbers of users for snaps outside of Ubuntu is based on the public data that it shares on the Snapcraft website. If you look at the core and the core 18 snaps, core 18 meaning the Ubuntu 18.04 core snap, these are used in most snaps, so it's fairly good source for data. This data shows that Linux Mint is the highest usage of snaps of non-Ubuntu distros. This may suggest that many Linux Mint users do not agree with Linux Mint on the subject of the snap format. This is still not me giving an opinion, to be clear. This is just a clarification for the context that they may not agree based on the numbers. I'll have sources in the descriptions related to the core and core 18 snaps if you'd like to check that data for yourself. So let's move on to some comments that Mark Shuttleworth gave. We did get comments from both sides, and I decided to dig deeper and found some comments from Mark Shuttleworth, the CEO of Canonical, so I felt that it would be really good to share those for this video. So again, I said this earlier in the video, but Mark Shuttleworth didn't respond directly to Mint or about Mint statements specifically, but he did respond to people on the Snapcraft forum covering similar subjects. So if you want to get the full discussion on the forum, I'll have that linked in the description as well. So a Snapcraft forum user by the name of Rogue listed off some issues that they wanted to be addressed for snaps. Some of these issues are similar to what Mint has said, which is why I am including them in this video. So the top 3 issues were startup speed, themes, and permissions. And then they go on to list some more, like lack of an easy-to-use mechanism for delaying, pinning, or updating, size of the snaps, and the centralized store. So startup speed being wanting them to load faster, themes relating to better support and matching the system themes, and permissions relating to more control and transparency as to what permissions is granted to a snap. So Mark Shuttleworth responded to this with, Rogue's list of top 3 things seems like a good set of priorities, and I understand good work is to be underway on all 3. And he also responds to the other things, such as Rogue's lack of an easy to use mechanism for delaying, pinning, or updating the snaps. Linux Mint said something similar about not being able to pin applications from updating, as I mentioned earlier. Mark Shuttleworth has responded to that, and he says that as for controlling updates, you can do this, and it will get smoother on the desktop over time. There are good ecosystem health and hygiene reasons not to revert to the old behavior of updates, maybe if someone cares, but there are also good reasons to give desktop users better control, and we will. Rogue also mentioned about the size of snaps, and quick clarification for context. While some snaps can be quite large in comparison to the other formats, there are also times where snaps are a smaller option. Mark Shuttleworth's response to this says that size is an interesting one. I like the dedupe idea, or deduplication for those who are not aware what that means, and would support Snapcraft work or patches to walk publishers through the process. Rogue then also talks about the centralized store. Shuttleworth's response to this centralized store topic is saying, as for a centralized store, there's nothing in Snapd's license that forces you to use the global store. The people who are actually working on that have a very long list of things that we and customers want to do, and it's a lot more effective for Snap users for us to progress those as a priority. None of this has slowed actual publishers from publishing actual snaps. The immediate follow-up of the centralized store discussion by most people is related to the server for the Snap Store not being open source. So, I did find a response from Shuttleworth about this particular topic, and here it is. Mark Shuttleworth says that we did that experiment with Launchpad. The people who said they wouldn't use it because it wasn't open source were the same people promoting a closed source alternative. When we open source Launchpad, they said they wouldn't use it. They said they wouldn't use it anyway because Canonical was the primary contributor. So the clarification for context, the closed source alternative he is referring to is not explicitly listed, but it's highly likely that he'll be referring to the now Microsoft-owned GitHub. Shuttleworth goes on to say, let's just focus on making it absolutely amazing for anybody wanting to publish their app to Ubuntu users to do so, and securely. And let's make it amazing for Ubuntu users who want to try apps from publishers they have never met in person to try apps also securely. So far, that's gotten thousands of publishers' apps installed on millions of devices, and let's be generous and say that any distro can take advantage of those apps which helps them and helps the publishers. I feel good that we are doing that. And to close out on what Mark Shuttleworth said, he says that I'm proud of the work that we continue to do with snaps. To be clear, we can improve things, and I know the team is committed to doing that. But as I look at it today, the experience we have enabled for publishers and consumers of apps on Ubuntu is a significant improvement, by and large, on what was possible before. I've been a contributor to Debian and Ubuntu for more than 2 decades, and snaps have decisively opened up the flow of high-quality apps to an audience I care about. End quote. So those are the sides of Linux Mint and Canonical and even Shuttleworth, and I did not interject, so I made it through the opinion temptation minefield. Success! Okay, now that we've reached the opinion phase of the video, maybe it's just me, but it seems like Linux Mint is confusing Ubuntu for Thanos, acting like snaps are just going to ruin everything. Okay, I did that purely for the joke opportunity, so yeah, I don't regret it. I'm good with that. But it's time for the real opinion section now. All of this stuff begs the question, why is Linux Mint so adamantly against snaps? They say it's because of a fear of control, but to some degree, the entire premise of their complaint is flawed because Linux Mint has already given Canonical a lot of control due to their reliance on Ubuntu. And I don't mean reliance on Ubuntu in regards to basing their distribution on Ubuntu. What I mean is, Linux Mint heavily depends on Ubuntu and Canonical in a very significant way. Linux Mint has positioned itself to use Canonical's infrastructure to serve packages to their users. I mean, this whole topic is because Canonical decided to make this change for Chromium in their own distribution. Why is that a problem for Linux Mint? Well, it's because Linux Mint is not a fork of Ubuntu. It's a soft derivative. Most people think that Linux Mint is a fork to Ubuntu in the same way that Ubuntu is a fork to Debian. But Linux Mint uses Ubuntu much more than just basing their distro on top of it. You see, a fork is a distro that is based on another distro, but has set up its own infrastructure rather than relying on the foundational distribution to facilitate serving packages to users. So, for example, Ubuntu is a fork of Debian, and similarly, Manjaro is a fork of Arch. Ubuntu and Manjaro have their own infrastructure that they set up, so while they do get a lot of their packages from the foundational distro, they provide those packages from their own servers. There's also a difference between a soft fork and a hard fork, but maybe I shouldn't make a video about what those terms mean, like fork, derivative, flavor, etc. You know what? Yeah, I'm going to do that. Be sure to subscribe. Back to the topic. So Linux Mint is directly dependent on Ubuntu because they didn't create a true fork. So the only reason this is even a problem is because they are relying on Ubuntu to serve the Chromium packages to users rather than doing it themselves. They're basically using Ubuntu's infrastructure to facilitate their own distro, but are bothered by this snap decision for Chromium because it doesn't let them use Ubuntu's infrastructure in the way they want to use it. This sounds a bit weird to me. You don't want to do the work to package it, so you rely on Canonical to do it for you. You don't want to finance the infrastructure to serve packages to your users, so you rely on Canonical to do it for you. Canonical decides they don't want to package Chromium in the previous way that they were doing it, and they're doing that for their own distribution, so you decide to create a blog post yelling about backdoors. If Linux Mint doesn't trust Canonical to make snaps with the best intentions, then why do they trust Canonical to serve deb packages to their users? If you don't trust Canonical, then why are you using Canonical's infrastructure? It just seems weird to me. I mean, this kind of situation might sound like biting the hand that feeds you, and in a way it sort of is. You put yourselves in this position by using Ubuntu's infrastructure as your own. Canonical doesn't have any obligation to facilitate your distro, yet they seem to be doing it anyway. So you get mad that they aren't facilitating it for you how you want them to? What? You might think maybe they can't afford to make their own infrastructure. I don't know, maybe that's true. At the very least, they could provide some donations to Canonical though for using it, but based on my research, they don't do that either. I don't think they've ever said what they do with the donations that they receive. I mean, they said in April of this year, they received $14,812, and that's just in donations. That doesn't count the sponsors like the gold sponsors or the contributors and the whatnot and all that. So I don't know how much it is, but more than 14,000. Just more than just that stuff though, because they make claims about snaps in a variety of ways that aren't really sharing the whole picture. For example, Linux Mint said that Snap becomes a requirement for you to continue to use Chromium and installs itself behind your back. This breaks one of the major worries that many people had when Snap was announced and a promise from its developers that it would never replace apt. So here's the whole picture. Ubuntu announced they were doing this 9 months ago. And Linux Mint is acting like this was some underhanded plot that they discovered in the depths of the code. Plus, this isn't replacing apt. This is making it easier to package one application, Chromium, for their distro. And more importantly, apt and deb files are not the best solution for application distribution anyway. If they were, we wouldn't have had companies completely shut down the idea of making Linux versions of their apps for over 20 years. Apt is a great thing for distro development and core structures. It's fantastic in those senses. But on the application layer, there's a lot of ways it isn't ideal, which I will explain those in the future episode on this channel that I talked about for the universal app formats. So subscribe and ring the bell. Let's go back to one of the quotes from Linux Mint. And I will inject my opinion here, unlike the first time. So, they say that you can't audit them, hold them, modify them, or even point snaps to a different store. All of that is inaccurate. You can audit them, hold them, modify them, and etc., as Mark Shuttleworth said. You've as much empowerment with this as you would with proprietary software. This is in effect similar to commercial proprietary solution, but the two major differences are it runs as root and it installs itself without you asking. The part that's weird about this is that it says it runs as root and installs itself without asking you. But when you install anything in Linux, you install it as root. You sudo apt install, sudo being super user or switch user do, and therefore privileges as if it was root. So the argument that running as root is a problem, deb files also have root access when you install them. So it doesn't change anything. So if you install something that's a deb file that is malicious or whatever, the damage has been done. And the installs itself without asking you, it's like, yes, but most people don't want to be asked. Like, did you mean to install this? Yes, I did. Most people don't care about the format or the container that it's in or whatever. They just don't care. They just want the application and that's it. Good to go. Linux Mint says to address this situation, we'll do exactly what we said we would. In Linux Mint 20, Chromium won't be an empty package, which installs snapd behind your back. It will be an empty package which tells you why it's an empty package and tells you where to look to get Chromium yourself. So let's consider what Linux Mint is saying right here. They are saying that this is so appalling to them that they won't trust Canonical to serve Chromium as a snap, but are totally fine with trusting Google to provide packages for their users. Google has already been caught trying to sneak stuff into Chromium, by the way. A few years ago, Google set up Chromium downloads, and what it did is that when you installed it, it would download a binary or a blob, like a non-open source lump of executable code. And this blob was responsible for listening to your microphone in case you say the OK Google thing. The issue here is it was automatically downloading an add-in module without being asked and without knowing what it's for. And secondly, the issue of code that turns on your microphone without asking you first. These are much more problematic than the things that they're bothered by snaps. So Google didn't think it was important to tell anyone. They did this so it took the awesome members of the community to find it and figure out what it was doing. So Linux Mint feels more comfortable with having people go get it from Google and giving Google root access, but apparently not Canonical, even though the Canonical servers are already being used by Linux Mint, so they already have that access. In Linux Mint 20, apt, this is a quote, in Linux Mint 20, apt will forbid snapd from getting installed. So Linux Mint has placed a direct breakpoint to installing snapd for their users. You have to jump through hoops to bypass. Apparently, a lot of people use snaps in Linux Mint though, so maybe they don't really know their user base as well as they think they do. At least not to the full degree. I mean, that sounds like a logical possibility to me since the Snap Store is not in Linux Mint, and snapd is not installed by default in any Linux Mint releases, yet Linux Mint users are clearly getting value from snaps, so they're manually doing this stuff. So they do say you'll still be able to install it yourself, and we'll document this in the release notes, but by default apt won't allow repository packages from doing this on your behalf. Now when they say apt won't allow snaps being installed automatically on your behalf, they're also blocking snaps in general. So by the fact that they're blocking snapd from being installed, if you manually choose to install, such as sudo apt install snapd, it will fail because they did this on purpose. So you have to run a particular thing. I'll have it in the video and in the description. It's sudo rm/etc or etc/apt/preferences.d /nosnap.pref. And this command is basically running a remove command on the root level of your file system to remove this particular file. Now, it is very important to be clear that you need to make sure that this command is exactly correct. You do not want to accidentally leave off this nosnap.preference or pref file because that will not end well. So if you're going to do this, be sure you have this exactly. Now I want to address the stuff that Mark Shuttleworth said. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, the closed source Snap Store. Yes, the software that runs the Snap Store is currently closed source. And for the record, I do disagree with the decision to keep it closed, though my main reason for disagreeing with it is to avoid discussions like this. If I were in this position to make that choice, I would have opened it up not to provide that as fuel for those anti-canonical people. I also understand why they didn't do that though. Providing something as open source does increase a lot to the workload because instead of just creating the thing that you want to create, you're also creating documentation, doing tech support, auditing code submitted if someone submits the code, triaging bugs, community management, and all sorts of stuff. And sure, Canonical could just do some code dumps of the store, not offering anything other than the code, but let's face it, the same people in the community that are giving them hate for this would give them hate for doing that too. And along that note, for those who say it's bad that there's only one store or repository for snaps, a central repository or store for a universal app format is not just important, in my opinion, it's a necessity. Flatpak proved that when they didn't offer a central store, so basically no one used them. And then all of a sudden, a third party creates the FlatHub, and it becomes the de facto central repo. And then people start using Flatpaks. I mean, there's a lot more to this topic, and I'll just wait for the upcoming video and just subscribe again. Universal Apps Format video coming soon. The summary of the situation is Linux Mint is using Canonical's infrastructure and is now mad about something they decided to do with their own infrastructure. So to stick it to Canonical, they are going to not just break Chromium for their users, but are also going to break snaps for their users. If Linux Mint users want to use snaps for things like Spotify, Discord, or whatever, they have to manually remove a file that Mint created to stop them from using snaps, because apparently user choice is not something Linux Mint wants to give. It's unfortunate that this is happening because I think that Linux Mint provides a lot of great value, such as the Cinnamon desktop environment and that kind of thing. I also think that Ubuntu provides a lot of great value, such as Ubuntu and snaps. So it's unfortunate that they decided to address it in this way, and I think it was handled very poorly. If Linux Mint wants to draw a line in the sand about snaps, breaking the ability for their users to use it without going through hoops, then I kind of can't recommended as the beginner distro anymore. Because it was on my list of like the top 5 beginner distros. But now you're putting in a breakpoint because you, I guess, philosophically disagree with it. So I don't know. It's a weird situation, and hopefully we can get this resolved and they will bring snaps back for the users, because it's silly. Or hey, just do what you're supposed to do and, set up your own infrastructure instead of using theirs and then complaining about it because somehow their infrastructure is yours to complain and control about. I don't know. Best of luck to Linux Mint and Linux Mint users. And I will continue to use snaps because I think snaps are quite valuable in many ways. And I use them every day, actually. So if you are curious about what snaps are, and you can check out my video that I created on this channel about 4 years ago. I'll have it linked in the show notes and in the cards. And if you're interested about the full Universal Apps format video I'm making, that will be coming out soon. I don't know when, but soon. So there's that. And if you want to get this awesome Linux is Everywhere t-shirt, you can go to destinationlinux.network/store and get it from the DLN store. This is an awesome shirt. I did happen to design it, so again, I'm a little bit biased, but it's also true. It's also true. destinationlinux.network/store to get one of these awesome Linux is Everywhere t-shirts. It has Tux blended into the background to convey the message that even if you don't know that Linux is there, it probably is. If you want that, go to destinationlinux.network/store again, and also check out the other stuff. We have some stuff for Tux Digital. There's a Tux Digital shirt. There's also a This Week in Linux shirt that you can get, and a bunch of other things like the new Destination Linux logo that I created for the podcast is now available as a shirt and also as a coffee mug, and a bunch of other stuff is available there. So check that out. And if you'd like to become a patron of Tux Digital and help me create this content and this channel, I was about to say show because I say that a lot for the This Week in Linux podcast, but I meant for this kind of video. If you would like to help me create this content, please consider becoming a patron by going to tuxdigital.com/contribute. There you will find links for becoming a patron for Patreon and sponsors. And if you are a patron on either side of those, you actually get rewards like early access to content and a variety of different other things. So I hope you found this video useful. That's it for this one. And if you did, please let me know in the comments below. If you have any suggestions or comments and anything like that, please let me know. I tried to cover it as much as possible, but this is also a really in-depth talk or in-depth topic. So I might have left off some things. I know I left off some things actually, but at the same time, it's also pretty difficult because it's mostly just opinion on one side and the other, and then also my opinion, so it's kind of hard to say, here's the definitive answer, because in my opinion, it's just, the format is fantastic because we need a universal format. Now, also, I agree that I think that universal formats for Flatpaks and app images are great too. I do agree with the open source server request. I do think that they should do that, but at the same time, I think snaps are still quite good. What do you think about snaps and Flatpaks and app images? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you next time for another Tux Digital video where I don't know what the topic will be yet. So follow me on Twitter to find out. @MichaelTonnell. See you next time. I need a better outro thing. I'll make one for the future. Yeah, that's a good idea.